COVID has come up during your introductions on so many occasions, and that's going to be the main topic for discussion today. And we have three people from Asian University for Women in Bangladesh, Natasha, Nazifa, and Shanuz. So I am not sure if the three of you were actually in Bangladesh when when this pandemic broke out. But let's start with Natasha. Not that we want to go alphabetically from here, but Natasha, please share with us, where were you when COVID happened?
Yeah, so I was studying at Asian University for Women, and I was in Bangladesh when COVID happened. And I think at first we didn't really realize the kind of impact it would have. We thought it would be kind of like it would pass. So at first it wasn't as serious as any of us thought it would kind of get to be. But then after a while, I think being in a developing country kind of changes the perspective of how you look at things like this, because there's already existing structural damages like in the government. So they get kind of highlighted within these, like when a pandemic comes about and all that. So I think at first it was kind of scary to be kind of away from family, and the university was obviously helpful and supportive in all regards, but it was a new experience to us, and we were thinking of what kind of solutions could we take towards it? Like, do we go home? What's going to happen? So I think one of the topics that, through one of these discussions that we had with the administration in the university and the student body as well, since we are kind of from so many different countries at the university, it was kind of difficult to make a single decision on behalf of everyone as well, because we are from 16 or more different countries in Asia, within Asia. And so talking about Sri Lanka itself, I think Sri Lanka and Bangladesh had kind of a similar reaction to the pandemic as well, in a way. I think most developing countries did. So at first there was restrictions, travel restrictions and all of that. So I think the first solution we had was to kind of get home safely, because that was kind of the most realistic and the most kind of at the moment we had to do that. And getting back home was a priority at that time. I think, but it took quite a long time for us to get back home because of the travel restrictions. And that part is where the concerns of mental health come in as well, because there is this whole undermining this issue, there is this whole kind of uncertainty as well. We were still studying, and how do we get to complete our degree, all those things. And like I said, we're from so many different countries, and so we hear different stories from different countries all over the place. And even Sri Lanka, the situation was not as good. So we were worried about our parents, our family back home and all that as well. So I think it did affect us in terms of our mental health quite a bit. Kind of experiencing it for the first time, and being away from home. So I think that's pretty much kind of the story behind it. And then we did safely come back home, like the Sri Lankan crowd. And yes, so maybe Shanuz, Nasifa could add to what their experience was like, because Shanuz is, I know, from Pakistan, and Nasifa is from Bangladesh. So maybe you could add to that experience.
So how long did it take you to get home to Sri Lanka?
Oh, it took us quite a while, I think a few months at least. Because of the travel restrictions in place, we had to kind of negotiate with the government. We even had to do that was the first time that we had to kind of get together and do some lobbying. We had to get together with the media, back home, and kind of get the government to send us a flight, basically, because none of the commercial flights were working. So that was kind of a new experience, and I got to understand how some of the government structures work. But yeah.
And how is the situation in Sri Lanka right now in terms of COVID, and what is the most pressing issue concerning COVID in your country?
So I think at the moment we are almost 50% vaccinated, which is a great thing. It was a slow start, but then I think we had a lot of help from different countries and the UN itself. So vaccination wise, I think we are on the right track. But then I think, like I said before, it has highlighted a lot of the structural issues within the government. And especially like in terms of what my background is, like gender studies, I think obviously always the minorities get more affected in these situations than anybody else. And women being like the largest minority in the world right now, I think there is like, for example, gender-based violence. And I saw in UNESCO, they predicted that about 11 million girls will not be able to go back to school like after the pandemic. So those are some of the concerns that at least I am concerned about at the moment. But obviously there's more pressing concerns in terms of economic recession and things like that as well in the country. It's definitely not at a good place when it comes to the economy of the country. So I think something that I'm concerned about as like a young adult is also that because I'm currently based in Sri Lanka and I don't really have the opportunity to go abroad to work. Like I've been searching for jobs and things like that, like in Sri Lanka itself. And, it's unfortunate that sometimes you have to select over your kind of basic survival. Like for a lot of people, I feel like, especially young people these days in developing countries, because that's all I can speak for, have to select between like the survival of you and your family over kind of the values that you align yourself with in terms of like, wanted to work at a job, wanted to work at a company, at a place that actually aligns with your sustainability goals and, things like that. So yes. Hopefully it improves. I'm optimistic. This is a good place to start with this conversation.
Absolutely. And Nazifa, you mentioned in a part of your application that your household has not only been affected by the economic recession that COVID-19 has brought, but you're more concerned about the health sector and also post-COVID-19 recovery. How that's going to manifest. So please, can you share with us a little more about what's on your mind?
So I felt that COVID-19, what it did was it basically highlighted the profound consequences of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation for human health, well-being, survival. And it has exposed the fragility of our systems and demonstrated that a sudden change, be it a pandemic or a climate shift, will affect the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable populations the most, as Natasha mentioned. So COVID-19 response also exacerbated many of the leading environmental concerns, such as plastic pollution and inadequate waste management, thanks to the rapid use and disposal of single-use plastics, like clothing items like PPE. There was a growing concern that it may be exposing waste pickers to secondary infections because of the nature of their work. And even though mobility restrictions have, in a broader scale, in a global scale, even though mobility restrictions have significantly reduced energy demand and the consequent greenhouse gases, both the energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions have started to bounce back to pre-2020 levels, which could cause a serious setback on the global efforts to address climate change. So these were some of the concerns that I had regarding how the COVID-19 recovery period in its own. Yeah.
In Shanice, please tell us about the situation in Pakistan in terms of COVID. How are you guys doing?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So in Pakistan nowadays, almost like 50% of the population is vaccinated. We are a close ally of China, so it's we are importing vaccines like every month. So like it's a law that you have to be vaccinated even if you are traveling in metro or in bus or in any of the public transport. So they will ask for your vaccination number, and after that, if you prove it, they will allow you to sit in or use the public transport. And apart from this, like school going children, they are going bi-weekly, so they are not going every day, and people are using masks, and the restaurants are closed, and people are maintaining physical distance. So the situation is quite good now. And apart from this, the economy of the country is reducing because the job sector is closed, and people are unable to go to even students are unable to go to schools, and teachers are unable to teach them in person, and the technology in Pakistan is not very good and not accessible to young people that they will take online classes. But in capital and in some of the large cities, the technology is quite good, so that teachers and students can interact there. But when I talk about the marginalized people and the people who are residing in villages, and I don't think they have good technology, because even there, like, the internet service is very poor. So it's difficult for students to access to education, and it's very difficult for a teacher to go to every home and teach their students. So COVID has affected the children directly, and indirectly the teachers, because of this they cannot get pay every month. So their salary got cut down, and because of this there is a very huge problem in job sector.
Thank you. And speaking of education, Jasmine, you mentioned that COVID-19 has aggravated existing problems, and primarily it is related to the public education. And you share some personal stories. So could you please share that story with the rest of the group today?
Yeah, sure. As you probably know, Korea, I think education is a very big portion that consists society. So even before COVID, I feel like education was such a big thing, like not just public education, but also private education. But I noticed from the experience, because I have 3 younger siblings, and they're all kind of in a different stage of educational process. So I got to experience like how it is for example, elementary school and like high school and for college, I guess. So I got to have that somewhat holistic experience, I believe. So for younger kids who go to elementary school, obviously most of the things that elementary school studies is not really based off a textbook, but rather it's an interaction, or it's an experience you have your teacher, like you form some kind of a rapport with your teacher, and that's how younger kids study. But because of COVID, it got really difficult. I do recognize that Korean government tried to start online platform where teachers can upload certain videos, and then each student has to complete it. But then the problem in Korea was that people started to go work faster than the school opened, the time the school opened. So mom and dad, like who work, like if they have working parents, they would have to go to work. They wouldn't study, they wouldn't work at home, but kids would be left at home to study through the computer. So I think there was a difficulty for those people. And what parents would do is they would hire private tutors so that they can actually study, since they realize public education, they won't really learn much from just simply like watching videos. But I think there, the educational gap kind of became widened in South Korea, because there was always, I guess, unfairness to those who have capital to have more private education and those who don't really have that resources. But I feel like because of the COVID, people who do have money and people who do have enough time and effort to care about these kids, they are taken care even better, because, like who needs public education? We can just study with, people from really good university, people who are really young, and people who, have so much experience, and they would study with those people. But kids who's relatively, less taken care of, the only thing they would get is a limited amount of public education. So I think there was another gap widening up because of the COVID in that scenario. And I think the fact that Korea is so centered with government, and a lot of issues in Korea is dealt by the government. I think that also created an issue how a lot of minorities don't really get to have a welfare, not necessarily like food and shelter, but welfare as in like mental welfare or, those kind of thing. Because even for elderly generation in Korea, they have this state run nursing home, I guess. So what elderly people would do is they would just go there and, kind of hang out with other elderly people, because there's a lot of, older generation who live alone in Korea. But I also heard that those people couldn't really do those socialization and they had to stay home. So I think it was not just the issue of, inequality in education, but also the issue of, minorities who don't really have access to the welfare they used to have before. So I think in terms of COVID, it kind of affected like all sectors around the world. So I think, everyone has probably something to say about this, because whatever you're interested in, I think COVID did, affect you one way or another. So I'm looking forward to hear from all of you.
And Dylan and Mark, actually, let me start with Dylan, because you're in Australia, but I understand that in Australia, each area is handling this COVID situation differently, right? Some of you are in the lockdown and some of you are not. So what are we not hearing about the situation in Australia? What is the most pressing issue in your country that's going on right now in terms of COVID?
I think so I can speak on more deeply on Sydney, because that's where I'm based in at the moment. I might go from like kind of macro to micro. So in Australia, we have different states and territories, and each state kind of looks after themselves and their citizens in there. So I guess on the macro level, COVID has really intensified a lot of state and territory tensions. So like Queensland, just above New South Wales, where I'm based in, they have like no cases, but then we have like 400 cases today, and they've kind of shut like a hard border. So especially for people who live in between New South Wales and Queensland at that junction, then it's been quite difficult in terms of like trying to access resources, health, and even just you can't go to the supermarket 5 minutes away because it's across the border. So things like that. And in a way, it's kind of intensified relationships between states, but also with the federal government, because things from the aged care sector to health infrastructure, like who's going to build the quarantine facilities for returning travelers and things, like it's kind of federal and state governments and local government just handing the buck around. And so I guess on the macro level, that's probably the biggest issue with COVID. I guess on a more micro or personal level, it would probably be COVID has really brought to life the disconnection that local governments have with communities, especially culturally diverse communities. So I'm thinking about it's a bit funny to say, because actually today is Freedom Day for Sydney in a way. We're coming out of lockdown. But before that, we've been in lockdown since the end of June, so around 3 months. And during this time, that is where we really saw that disparity in how the local government treats different communities. So one example is like in the eastern suburbs, Bondi, where it's more affluent, where you have a lot of nice houses. You had people on Bondi Beach and it was completely crowded. But if you go onto the other side of the city in Western Sydney, then you have like police forces there harshly enforcing rules, and also, with riot police, horse on back. So you see that kind of big disparity. And even though supposedly Sydney is all meant to be on the same standards, but in reality, it doesn't appear that way. So on a more micro level, COVID really highlighted the broken trust that local governments have with culturally diverse communities. And some tangible examples of that included like, because COVID is something which affects us all and requires mobilization within like communities and nationally and internationally. And within these culturally diverse communities, like getting translation support or getting family members and friends to try and convince their peers of like the benefits of vaccines and getting vaccinated, that wasn't there because I think it's long been kind of, in my opinion, kind of a hands-off approach in local governments and not really on the grounds and connecting with community leaders and understanding how their unique systems work. So, for example, like what the basic definition of family in a group, because this is significant given the restrictions in Sydney about how you define a household, how you define how many people you can have. So like I know in my household, like Chinese, then I have my immediate household, but I'm also like 3 minutes away from 3 other family groups. So this pandemic has made it quite hard for us to go from weekly dinners to now considering ourselves as like estranged or separated family members in a way. And yeah, so without governments having an understanding of these sub-networks or cultural practices, how we organize ourselves, how we deal as a family with mental health, without governments understanding this, then it leads to poor outcomes on health because people don't get vaccinated, on mental health, on just general peace and harmony in the community.
Okay, and Mark, you are from Australia, but right now you're living in South Korea. So has when you moved here and then pandemic happened, looking at Australia from South Korea, what are the main differences in terms of the COVID and how people are handling the situation?
It's really fluctuated, to be honest. So, for example, at the start of this year, Australia was basically open. So during the Australian summer, I was seeing all my friends and whatever sort of at the beach, outside. There was no restrictions basically. So I was jealous and a little bitter because it was a very cold Korean winter and much harsher here, as you know. Things closing early and strict restrictions on how many people you can meet. But then, I mean, once Delta sort of took off, Australia, it just seemingly wasn't prepared for it at all. And so really the tables turned. I was happy then to be in Korea as opposed to Australia. So it's hard to say, it's hard to, have a kind of blanket comparison. But I just wanted to also touch on, I think like Dylan and also Jongmun were talking about governance. And I think that COVID has really highlighted so many weaknesses in governance at all levels. So for example, at local levels in terms of how governments are dealing with different local communities. And then in Australia on a national level, you have this state system and it's just so dysfunctional in this context where borders are being closed and that's impacting people. They can't see family or whatever. It's also impacting just basic economic activity. And then that's also the case with national borders. But then on a broader level, again, I mean, this is by its very nature a global issue and a global problem. But in terms of governance, we're dealing with this as nations and it's everyone's, very focused on their own country. And that just doesn't seem to be working very well to solve this problem. So yeah, that was something I wanted to touch on. And then also in the Korean context, I think as Jongwon sort of mentioned that a lot of the times when decisions are made here, it's not always very consultative. I don't think a lot of it's very top down. A lot of the way the Korean government makes decisions, and that was, I think, made clear earlier this year. For example, there was a case where a lot of foreign migrant workers. I guess for those who don't know, there's a huge number of migrant laborers here. mainly from South and Southeast Asian countries, a lot of them working in factories. And so there was outbreaks in these factories. And then the government just sort of came in and mandated COVID testing for these people and saying, if you don't do it, you get faced with a huge fine. And so this was just really stigmatizing and singling out one small group of people. And then there was a big uproar about this. So I guess it was just kind of highlighting again how different groups are treated and how, existing ways of making decisions by governments are really flawed in sort of key ways. So that was very tangential to your initial question, but yeah, just some point I wanted to make.
Yeah. No, seriously, thank you so much for sharing that and also for pointing that out. Again, like as you mentioned, if any of the foreigners are tested positive for COVID, and it's like the attention is for all the foreigners residing in Korea, which just doesn't seem to be fair. Claudine, you're especially frustrated because you're very much looking forward to interacting with the Chinese people in China, and while you're going to school there. And so, Claudine, let's take a moment and then kind of picture an imaginary world. Just fast forward, let's say 2-3 years, and if we still have to be dealing with this pandemic, and you're most concerned about the social interaction, a lack of social interactions that is being caused by this COVID-19. How do you envision the world without these social interactions, and especially for young people like yourself who are in dire need of education in a more social settings, more diverse settings?
I feel like if this continues for 3-5 more years, this is going to be a big problem. Maybe a less obvious one, like health, mental health, those are obvious problems, right? But the lack of like social and cultural exchanges, I think they can also lead to very big problems. And for example, as someone who is studying, I feel like we will end up just trusting what we read from books. But that's very different from what you experience when you live with people from a different background, from a different culture. And I've been realizing that many of my classmates are getting really frustrated. And many of my classmates, for their graduation thesis, they were trying to do like interviews in China, in different regions of China, but now they had to change their research topics because they cannot be in China. And now they're working on maybe things that they're not very interested in, or things that they can just access online. Of course, that has its own merits, right? But at the same time, I don't think we can live like that for 5 more years. There needs to be good understanding between people from different countries. And as you've seen, there are already problems between China and America, right? And I believe students who move between countries, Chinese students who go to America, American students who go to China, they're the people who can actually help bridge the gaps between how the two countries see each other, right? But this has been impossible over the last 2 years or 2.5 years. So I think it's a big problem. And it's not even just education, because when I was here, I was thinking about something to do that can help me interact with maybe Korean people in Rwanda, especially volunteers from KOICA, right? But when I contacted the embassy, I heard that all the volunteers, they flew back home. Now there are no KOICA volunteers in Rwanda. And I think the same thing is happening in other countries as well. So even though I understand that what comes first is health, that quarantine is very important, closing borders was very important. But if this continues to happen for a longer time, I worry about how countries are going to see each other when interaction between people from different countries are very, very limited.
So Loic and Hwapyeong, you guys are both living away from home at the moment. Loic, you're from Switzerland, you're living in Korea, and Hwapyeong, you're from South Korea, you're living in France. And by the way, welcome back to the light, Hwapyeong. and but just I'm sure that you're keeping up with your hometown news by the on the internet. But please tell us, any of you can go first. Tell us what's the problem with the news nowadays? What are you not hearing that you really want to hear in terms of COVID? Or if there's any. When you're, let's say, to be more specific, when you look at the news on the internet to find out the COVID situation in your hometown, and yes, you will see the number increasing or decreasing, or you'll find the new government policies or the vaccination status. But what is that you really want to hear when you look at the news?
Would you like to answer first?
No, go for it.
I don't know. Well, I think what was really interesting first, and maybe then it's the same for you as well, Wapian, is to be able to live the coronavirus in two totally different societies and two different approaches, the European and the, let's say, more liberal one, and the Korean, a bit more enforced one. And that made it really interesting on a personal level. So many topics to discuss with COVID, but I think relating to the press, I think what was really interesting for me is how the news is framed. So in Korea, I feel like there was also, in part, dramatization compared to the European or the Swiss news in terms of, for example, you can find the number of cases that are imported into Korea every day, which is data that no one in Europe has never really, well, they tracked it, but they never published it. They didn't really care about it so much. And here it was a lot, noticing which communities where you had these stories of persecution at the beginning of the first wave with the like the nightclubs in Itaewon, the church community, Shanchati, I forget the name of it, but there was quite a scandalous approach to it, and the way COVID was a bit framed in Europe was a lot less scandalous. It was always focusing on when are what are the measures, understanding the measures, are people getting around it, when will they get lifted, when will we get the vaccine. It framed it in a lot more liberal way. And I think as a final point that I would also like to bounce back on, it also pertains to the governance of the COVID and the mentality of the people. So I think the mentality in Switzerland, in Europe, was that all the measures were going against your freedom of your personal freedom. And people were against that. Even now, there's still protests when the measures there's nearly none. There's still people protesting in the streets because they're too strong. And in Korea, it's a bit the other way around. So there were very, very strong measures, which people, to me, it seems accepted pretty well, even though there were some privacy rights that seemed to be definitely violated. And it's very interesting to see the differences in that.
Hapyo, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think for me, I was in Valencia, Spain at the time working as a teacher at a school. And so I was comparing the news between Spain and Korea quite a bit. For me, I would say that it went both ways in terms of the qualm that I had. Not necessarily a qualm, but more so just frustration about the fact that, a lot of these news coverages were focusing on very big topics related to governance, related to politics, And of course, those are very important, but there were also moments when, you know, especially because COVID, you're locked in your room, you're not going anywhere. It kind of almost made you feel as though like you're only living in one world and that's everything. And it's really, you know, hard to see beyond what's happening in your life. And so there were moments when I was hoping to see more coverage related to the more everyday life, personal issues that we can relate to on an easier level. And I didn't necessarily feel like I was getting that through the news. I think if we look at some of the shifting platforms like Vice, ID, Vox News, and, you know, a lot of these social media driven ones, you see a lot more of that, where they're focusing on very alternative perspectives. But with the bigger traditional newsrooms, I would say less so. And that was something that, yeah, I was frustrated about.
So our common theme here is obviously sustainability, but in many different areas. This question is for all of you now, it's an open discussion. Do we understand it differently in this COVID era? So let's go ahead with, okay, let's just ask the first question. What is sustainability in your mind? So let's go backwards from here. Hapyeong.
Going straight to the deep questions at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
Sustainability.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
In my mind, I would say sustainability has to do with, you know, just at the root of the word, being able to maintain and continue the life we have. And, you know, whether that's environmentally, emotionally, mentally, not just looking at a short period of time where we're maximizing our pleasures or efficiency, but looking long term to see what works on a macro scale for the future generations.
And Claudine, do we understand your definition of sustainability differently these days?
I wouldn't say that we now understand sustainability differently, but I feel like maybe what has changed is the weight that it has. I feel like before maybe people took sustainability as a matter of choice. Do you choose to establish a sustainable agenda, sustainable practices, because you thought even if you don't, it's okay. But I feel like in the COVID era, it's different. We've come to realize that it's a must. It's not a matter of choice. Otherwise, the future is just going to be a mess. Yeah, so I think that maybe that is the change that COVID has brought when it comes to our understanding of sustainability.
And Maide, what is your definition of sustainability?
I think sustainability is like meeting the needs of our generation without compromising the needs of future generations. But I think sustainability now has to go hand with technology. I think right now, for example, in Peru, I think there is an urge for digital transformation. Many businesses, I think around the world, have gone bankrupt. And I think also there are a lot of employees that need to learn technical skills, need to acquire technical skills. And I think with technology, we can also improve the healthcare system in Peru, for example. And also, for example, in Peru, a lot of students have lost like 1 year of their studies in their undergraduate. And I think in Peru, it has revealed the weaknesses of our healthcare system and our education system. And I think COVID also has impacted our mental health. For example, I know that in Japan, in October 2020, around 900 women suicide. And that really impacted me. So I really think that nowadays mental health and also living a healthy life, it's really important. And now people are more aware also that we need to make more sustainable choices if we really want to for example, for businesses, if they really want to increase their productivity and be successful in the long term, they really need to choose more sustainable choices.
And Shanuz, and how do you think we understand sustainability differently?
Yeah, one of my fellows mentioned clearly that before it was a choice, and now we have to like adopt sustainability, even like in our daily lives in business sector. You know, before before the COVID era, people were just running behind profits, and they were just slaves. Young people, we can understand and we can realize, and we even read in theories that we are slaves of capitalism. So we were always thinking of money and of growing our own businesses and all of this. Like we as a people never think of environment, and we didn't think of other people. But now COVID made us realize that sustainability is vital and very essential for every human being as well as for every business sector. So if we include sustainability in a business sector, then we will preserve things, and we'll use the things for ourselves, and we'll also preserve our natural resources, so that our future generation will use the resources as per their needs. So I think now sustainability is must, and COVID made us realize that we have to include sustainability in our day-to-day lives.
Nazifa, let's go back to your earlier comment about how concerned you are about the post-COVID-19 recovery and how that's going to manifest. How can we tackle these problems over the next 5-10 years ahead? I mean, let's say if you are heading the Youth United Nations Council, if there's such a thing, I'm sure there is. What would be your suggestions in terms of tackling the COVID-19 recovery in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think the role of the state will be quite different from how we understand it. So the shock caused by the pandemic is making even more pressing some of the questions that we already had regarding the economy. So there is a demand to build back better, as we say it, because it was clear that some things had already started to go wrong and have now gotten worse because of the pandemic. For instance, one is a low pay and inadequate conditions of some kinds of jobs, such as essential worker, such as job environment for essential workers and healthcare workers. Another is the alarming decline in environmental indicators from extreme weather events and loss of biodiversity, both which are threatening our food supplies and to polluted air and the consequences for the human health. So I think the role of the state will be significantly different during the recovery period. We have grown used to the idea that government and markets are separate spheres and that the market generally knows best. Yet in the crisis response across the world, we have a demonstration of how dramatically governments can intervene in managing the economy. So it might take years for the state to actually step back from the control, even if the government really wants to, because with a focus on a new infrastructure a new infrastructure investment and green transition, on establishing job schemes, and on making up for the educational deficit that was caused due to the disrupted learning through 2020 and beyond, and on supporting key industries such as travel and arts, I think there will be a lasting change in how we perceive the role of the state. And I do believe that the state has an important role in the COVID recovery period.
So let's all 10 of you, imagine that we are sitting in an APEC meeting and you guys are the head of states. So I'm going to start with you, Jasmine. Let's say you're the South Korean head of state sitting in the APEC conference, and here we are in the middle of the pandemic. What kind of new policy would you like to announce? Just be creative, anything. You don't have to try to sound intelligent or academic. You could just address your personal immediate concern regarding COVID-19. So if you were the head of state, and if you want to announce a new policy that will alleviate the current situation, what could that be?
Just for the clarification, would this policy about international community, or would it be about like Korea specifically?
Doesn't matter. And this is for all 10 of you to think about, because Hwa-Pyong, you're going to be the last, because I'll give you some time to wake up. So yes, Jasmine, anything, international, local, anything. What would that be? Or if you need more time, if anyone else has an idea, let's say, Mark, you are the Australian Prime Minister, and Loic, you are the Swiss Prime Minister. Let's all imagine. And then all of these things you just told us about the problems that are surrounding you because of the pandemic. And if you were to come up with a new policy to help the people in your country or internationally, and if you're to announce a new policy?
So two things in my mind. I think it's in slightly different aspect, but for the first one, I always thought COVID did give a lot of power to the state than before, as in it allowed state to have justification for intervention. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but I think it's a clear trend that we can see. And now we see that, as Nazifa mentioned, how government has much of control and power under the emergent situation. So I think in that sense, if I were to be the head of the state, I would think it would be a great opportunity to push for certain agenda that I had in my mind, whether it would be international network or like domestic policy. But I always, since I think everyone would like to be more cooperative, every state, because we're under the same situation of COVID, and it's not like, a more developed country were less damaged or developing countries were more damaged. It's just that, of course there were issue with, health measures, but still the impact was similar. So that, under that consideration, I think I would open up the conversation about developmental aid, because I think how it is formed is very inefficient, because similar developed countries provide developmental aid to similar countries, similar regions. So I heard there often overlap in terms of developmental aid. So maybe I would use that platform to discuss about developmental aid, whether that form would be from the government or from the private sector. I believe government has a power and legitimacy to talk about it more now that they have more power. I don't know if I make sense. I feel, but
No, I got you off guard, and I'm sorry about that. But that's totally fine what you just said. And if anything that is directly related to you personally, or anything that concerns your family or friends, those are the things we're interested in, really, in finding out, because. Yes, just everybody, what we read in the news every day, we find in CNN what Dr. Fauci said, what this government did, what that government did, But seriously, I am asking you to perform this exercise because I'm not sure how many of you find those news headlines directly relevant to you. So I am asking you to put yourself in an imaginary scenario to, let's say, if you are being appointed to make this world better, and if you are actually in the position to do so, then what would be the one thing that you would like to see happening? So, and I hope you all kind of understood that. So again, this is a totally imaginary exercise, and please don't feel pressure to make it sound any intelligent or academic. Seriously, this is just amongst ourselves. So Loic, do you want to be totally imaginative and pretend that you are the head of state of Switzerland? And what did you do to resolve the COVID crisis if you were that person?
Yeah,
or Mark
difficult.
Hopkins, do you want to go
I have a few minutes
first?
to prepare an answer already.
Sure. Okay. Anyone who has anything in their minds that you want to?
I have a few suggestions.
Okay.
But I think that Dylan raised his hand first, so maybe you want to go first?
Yeah, Dylan, you go first, and then we'll move on to Nasifa.
Okay. So for me, I would say ministers, so anyone in a decision-making power for a particular portfolio, they have to be appointed based on a minimum baseline of experience, skills, and knowledge. So what I mean by that is, for example, like the Minister of Multiculturalism needs to have lived experiences, study, experience or training in multicultural initiatives and communities, rather than, for example, like in Australia, the current situation is like the ministers, they jump between portfolios every 5 months, and it means that you don't build any trust with communities or the people affected, and also you have no expertise in the area, so why are you making decisions on this year? So that would be the decree that I put in.
Very good. Okay. And Nazifa, back to you.
I think you meant Natasha.
Natasha.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Natasha. I'm sorry.
Yeah, to be frank, I'd replace most of the cabinet members in our government. I hope they won't listen to this. But like Dylan said, I think definitely like criteria for a minister to be selected, that should be like priority, because these people are the ones who actually decide our future, decide our economy and everything. And I think something that I've realized is like the underlying theme throughout this COVID pandemic has been sort of the economic impact, economic effect versus like health mortality, like that impact versus the economic impact. So maybe I'll start with, honestly, I feel like the budget that we have is not enough to do all the things that I'm about to say. But hopefully if we have help, like I'm sure we can figure out a way. But then one thing would be to kind of restructure the public healthcare system. Not restructure exactly, but invest in the public healthcare structure, first of all, because that has been one of the main like key issues that we had when dealing with the pandemic. So, and it's definitely an investment for the future generations as well. So that would be the first thing. And also, I think another thing that would be that I would kind of propose is to invest in like social entrepreneurship, but specifically for like youth. I feel like that's kind of missing, especially Sri Lanka is kind of like a tourist-based country as well. So with the pandemic, that was like tourism was just in shambles, and we have lost quite a bit of budget in terms of that. But if we can kind of invest in social entrepreneurship, but for youth, I feel like I'm sure that the youth can come up with startups that will help both kind of, I guess, reinstate these kind of structural difficulties that we have in the system. So for example, I saw in India, there were like these medical like health startups that actually supported the pandemic, like, So the solutions, they kind of brought up solutions to the pandemic, especially in like the rural places. So maybe that's something that I would do, actually invest in building up like entrepreneurship within youth. So that would be one thing. And also I think I would bring regulations to companies in terms of, because sustainability was something that we talked about before. So I would definitely bring up regulations, because something that I've realized is also that like as a consumer, individual behavior is not, even if we change it, it's not as impactful as that can be done by, like the pollution that's done by big corporations. So if I'm the head of the government, I would make sure that I have regulations in place so that it becomes like mandatory for a company to have certain sustainability practices and, criteria for that. And I think something that we lack in Sri Lanka is also technology. And this was something that was talked by Jasmine as well, especially when it comes to education. Nowadays, it's remote learning. And so like just simple things that could be, like the most basic thing in some other countries is not the case like in Sri Lanka at the moment. So internet connectivity. So that's something that I would invest in, given that I have the money. And also something that was kind of relevant nowadays is like vaccine disparity. So maybe I'll talk about, I don't think like as a country we would be able to kind of give development help to other countries, but then I would definitely talk about like vaccine disparity and how the distribution of vaccine works and how it can be more equal in terms of distribution, especially towards like developing countries, and how maybe developed countries can like have more impact in the kind of help that they give. Because I feel like just giving money and not being kind of accountable for it also creates lots of problems, because there's obviously going to be corruption, there's power, greed and all that stuff. So to kind of reduce that within the system, like the countries that give aid, I feel like should kind of be more accountable towards the actual consequences that comes with the aid. So that was all over the place, but those are some of the things that I had in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of issues to resolve, but okay. Thank you for that, Natasha. Next, anyone?
Me. Do you hear me?
Yes, Maite.
Yeah, if I were the president, I think one of the things I would do would be to make mandatory that tech professionals do kind of like a volunteering service, like training and teaching professors how to use digital platforms. Because I think, for example, in primary schools, a lot of professors, they don't really know how to use simple platforms like Google Meets or Zoom. And actually, my mom, she's a teacher and she teaches secondary school. So when the COVID hit Peru, she didn't know how to use many platforms. So I really helped her too. But I think there are a lot of professors that they don't really have this kind of help, and I think tech professionals can help in that. And also, other thing I would do is to invest more in education. I think in Peru, we really need to prioritize education and also to restructure the health system. And yeah, that's the things that come to my mind. Thank you.
No, that's really good because these are the things that we want to hear. And Mark?
Yeah, as someone mentioned, like if I was the leader of my country, I'd be doing a lot of things differently, I think. But I was also going to mention the global distribution of vaccines, because I think that, I mean, as I mentioned before, this is, fundamentally global issue, and dealing with it in these sort of isolated, national units has just exacerbated the problem. So I think that would be absolutely number one. And then maybe more domestically, but it's relevant everywhere, would be a focus on addressing all types of inequalities, because as we mentioned, COVID has highlighted and exacerbated so many inequalities across, took that gender-based violence or access to education, etc. But I mean, also the fact that these inequalities have been there has contributed to the worsening of COVID in many ways. For example, people that have to go to work and are being exposed and then spreading it further in the community. So like really tackling that underlying inequality is I think a huge thing.
If we have time, can I share my response now for the hypothetical thought experiment?
Sure.
Yeah, so for me, I think I kind of struggled to come up with an answer when you first posed the question. Just because to me at least, there is a lot of disconnect between government and policymakers and a lot of community-based issues that are inherent. And so going back to the question about like, what is sustainability? I think a big part of it is, on an individual level, avoiding burnout in whatever way that means. And then on a bigger level, that means, of course, like looking at things like climate change, where we're making sure we're not going to physically burn out, or like things like racism or like sexism and all of those sorts of bigger macro issues that impact us on a personal level and ultimately end up burning us out very quickly as well. And at the end of the day, to me, those sorts of issues are something that's decided by the individuals that make up local communities. And I don't necessarily think, national or international level solutions are going to fix everyone's problems, because they're not all the same problems. And so for me, a big part of why I'm so passionate about education is because it's had such an important role in forming the sense of community and sense of identity that I've had like growing up. And so I would say, if anything, I would just invest a lot more money into community-based organizations, public libraries, schools, and give them the agency to act on the issues that they find within their smaller circles.
Right. Okay.
Would it be fine to go after him? I'll keep it short, because he talked about education, and that's something that I also value very much. Great. So yeah, as he mentioned, schools are very important, not just for me, but for many other people, especially young people. When schools closed, there are kids who cannot eat because they used to have lunch at schools. Maybe home, there's always trouble, domestic violence, and schools were the place where they can rest, play with their friends. And for like adult students like myself, that's where we meet other people, learn from them, build strong connections. But schools were the first things to close when COVID hit. And in some countries, schools are still closed, and they felt like students were marginalized. People were talking about businesses opening up. They're talking about traveling of like, maybe people involved in businesses. Even in my country, Rwanda, tourism continued because tourism is very important for our economy, but didn't seem like schools were that important for policymakers and governments. So if I was given a chance to voice my concerns on a higher level, I would make sure to tell people that it's very important to talk about sustainability in education and the quality of education, because online learning is not necessarily the quality that we hope for, right? So yeah, when another pandemic comes, schools, are they going to close again and again and again? Like, we cannot keep this thing going. So yeah, I think we should think about more sustainable ways of keep schools running and in-person learning. Yeah, that would be my suggestion.
That's great. Thanks.
And can I just say that I think you really raise a good point, because when I was teaching and then COVID hit, it kind of really like brought to light the fact that, you know, in a lot of places, schools are basically babysitting clubs, and parents and policymakers kind of realize, and they put so much pressure on schools to like provide food, provide education, provide mental help, and all of these different things, but then they don't give them any actual resources to do those things effectively. And it kind of helps realize that, you know, there's a lot of different issues that schools are trying to tackle all at once, when in actuality, it should be being addressed by a lot of other organizations or policymakers as well. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about more openly as well.